Today we have with us Josh McLaren. He's been a House member for 2 terms and a senator for 2 terms. He has a degree from University of Georgia, and he calls himself a double dog Georgian, and I will have to talk about that. He also went on to has a degree from Yale Law School, and he's done mainly appellate work with judges and other organizations to see how the law really applies when people appeal their cases. So, Josh, anything more personal about you that you'd like the voters to know?
Sure. Well, thanks, Paul. Yeah, double dog refers to getting multiple degrees, undergrad and graduate, from the University of Georgia. And fun fact, the law school, I think, originated that term, Georgia Law School, and they were really possessive of it. So if you got a graduate degree from like arts and sciences and you said, "Oh, I'm a double dog," and for a long time there, the law school fought you on that. But they have recently, Georgia has actually created a joint enrollment program called Double Dog. So they have definitively ended the debate. I'm sorry to the Georgia Law School. So I grew up here and grew up in Cobb County. I represent part of Fulton County now, but drove through all the places I represent now when my dad was taking me to school as a kid. So glad to be doing what I'm doing now and have been doing for the last 8 years. It's been a really rewarding way to connect with my home state. I will say that I wish the circumstances were a little different nationally, which is part of what motivated me to run in the first place. And so I think it's up to all of us to get involved and be the change you want to see. Those are platitudes, but I've tried to make it my life's work for the last decade, and I'm running for lieutenant governor to continue that work and to try to bring our values and our fight to a statewide scale.
You've been in the legislature for 8 years,
8 years, yeah, that's right.
and those years have been controlled by a Republican majority. So I think the big question for Democrats is how would things be different if we had a Democratic majority or if we had a Democratic lieutenant governor?
It would be incredibly different. And, Republicans will say, well, you guys were in charge for 100 years. And they'll talk about Democrats before the early 2000s, but it was a different time. I mean, Democrats now look and talk differently than before the early 2000s when Republicans took over in Georgia. So the Democrats of today are a much broader coalition, committed to diversity, committed to common sense economic prosperity for people, policies that will make sure that people have what they need, working people specifically, not big corporations. And the new Democratic Party is committed to the little guy, the working guy, just like the talking points used to be a long time ago. But I think the difference now is we have a much more inclusive picture of what that means. And so I do think this state is ready to return to a model that is focused on working people as opposed to tax breaks for huge corporations. So if Democrats take over, I think that we are going to be the party of responsible common sense policies that have 70% or more approval. Expanding Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, which would ensure hundreds of thousands of Georgians overnight. It would stabilize rural hospitals, and it would lead to decreased costs in the healthcare system for all of us, regardless of whether we're on Medicaid or not. That is an incredibly popular policy in Georgia, and we're only one of about 10 states, I think, that have not done it. It's really a common sense thing that Georgia has said no to, pretty much only because Barack Obama was the president when the Affordable Care Act was passed. Those politics, I don't want to point too many fingers right now, but I think a lot of people oppose the Medicaid policy because of who authored it. And that is at best ignorant, at worst racist. And so I think we need to do what we've been needing to do for over 15 years and get that done. Well, under current Republican leadership, there's a lot of hemming and hawing and hesitation. Or from Brian Kemp, we had an outright denial of Medicaid expansion. He says he's never going to do it. And so we'd have to wait for a different administration. So that's 8 more years that Georgia's had to wait. Republicans just did a political logjam assisted by gerrymandering. They drew themselves such safe districts that they felt like they never had to be responsive. I think you'll see a few policies like that in the first couple of years that everybody can really agree upon. And I think there'll be a lot of celebration around that.
If you're lieutenant governor and you have a majority of Republicans in the Senate and a majority of Republicans in the House, which may be, I wish it was different, but if that's the case, how would you operate as lieutenant governor with a Republican-controlled Senate?
Sure. So no doubt they get to write the Senate rules. Whoever's in the majority, they're writing the rules package. And the Senate rules are the rules that govern inside the chamber. So they're not statutes, they're not constitutional law. They're just the rules that bind senators in conducting business. What kind of motions you can make. The lieutenant governor doesn't have a lot of formal powers in the Constitution. In the Georgia Constitution, there's only two things really that the lieutenant governor does. One is to replace the governor if that's ever necessary for any reason. And the second is to be president of the Senate. In fact, the Constitution says the lieutenant governor shall be president of the Senate. And what that means is that you stand up there with a gavel and you preside. Literally, the word preside is contained within president over the Senate business. So if somebody wants to be recognized, you're calling on senators, you're declaring when bills are passed and hitting the gavel. But it's more than just ceremonial. There's a lot of procedural power that goes with the lieutenant governor role. If a Republican wants to make a motion, you don't have to recognize it. You can say, I don't want to recognize that motion. Or you could rule that an amendment to a bill is out of order for some reason, that it's not germane. If it's a bad amendment that has nothing to do with the content of the bill that's being proposed. Now, can the majority overrule the lieutenant governor if he or she makes those determinations? Yes. The majority always has the power to disagree with a ruling of what's called the chair, the person controlling the meeting, by 29 votes. That's a majority of the 56 votes in the Senate. It's hard to get 29 votes sometimes. Even if you're in the majority, if somebody's a doctor's appointment or they're in the anteroom and they're not paying attention, they've got to be on their feet. So whereas before they were used to 10 years, 20 years of being lazy, essentially, they don't have to work that hard because they've got a trifecta of the governor, the House, and the Senate. So they know what their playbook is going to be ahead of time, and they just yawn and sit there and vote yes on everything that they've already planned in advance. That will no longer be the case. So if you have a Democratic lieutenant governor, I could make procedural rulings that are hostile to what the majority wants to do, and they'd have to pay close attention, be vigilant, and work together to try to stop me. So it makes their workday a lot more intense. They might have to break a sweat. And in addition to that, there's a bully pulpit. The lieutenant governor can access media and go to the cameras for 11 Alive and WSB and Fox 5 and say, we don't like what's happening. Republicans are passing this legislation that they don't think anybody's going to pay attention to, that hurts working people or it takes more rights away. And they're counting on you not to notice. And so it's a very powerful messaging platform to be able to shape public opinion and get the word out about some of the abuses that Republicans have been historically getting away with without more scrutiny. And then I think in terms of getting to a Democratic majority and in organizing Dems throughout the state, traveling statewide, just like I have been on this campaign, rally us together and get the resources that we need to get a majority in the state Senate and the state House, hopefully in the next couple of years.
On the fiscal side, in other words, the money side of the government. The government taxes us, so we're going to pay amount for something, and then it provides services. And that supposedly we don't get a good deal there. We don't mind paying taxes if we're going to get something good out of it. Kind of what's your philosophy of that, and what did you see in the last session might be the philosophy on the Republican side of our politics?
Republicans have really no actionable ideas about how to improve life for working people. They don't have a fix on healthcare. They don't have really anything to speak of on affordable housing. The only thing on affordable housing they really want to do is strike down every building code across the country so that builders can build, 9-story wooden houses that have no design standards, so that, there's more supply. That's their only real idea on some of this stuff. And so instead, when it's time for election year and the word affordability is on everybody's minds, Republicans have one thing in mind: tax cuts. That's it, tax cuts. They think if they can defund government, break government apart into pieces and throw it away for scrap, that'll make the voters happiest. And by making that, taking that position, they have sort of expressed their cynicism that voters believe in government at all. They think that they're betting that voters don't think that the state government can do anything for them. We've got $15 billion in state surplus, right? Famously, we keep talking about this surplus money. And we've just been sitting on it and waiting for, quote unquote, a rainy day. Well, when the federal government failed to extend healthcare subsidies for millions and millions of Americans, and people in November and December, when it was time to re-enroll for their health insurance, when they saw their premiums go up from $200 to $900 a month. I think they're pretty confident that government can do something about it because government just was doing something about it. And then when those subsidies were taken away, it was like a rug was pulled out. Well, the reality is that state government could pay to replace those lost subsidies. For $700 million per year, we could replace almost all those lost subsidies, up to 400% of the poverty line, for people who really need the health care, the help with it. Otherwise, they'll fall off the rolls. The way that we would raise that 700 million is we tax insurance companies, which I think is pretty popular, and they're making billions in profits, so I think they can afford it, and raise the cigarette excise tax, which is a good public health policy. And we have a very below average cigarette excise tax in Georgia. So if you do those two things, you can pay for basically all those lost subsidies. But the Republicans in charge are not even talking about that. The only thing they're talking about is going the opposite direction, which is instead of raising revenues in smart ways from people who can pay, the Senate wanted to eliminate the income tax by 2032. It's half the state budget, just gone, right? The House this past year said we're going to eliminate all homestead property taxes on your first home. Well, I'm sure people love that idea in the abstract. I'd love to have my money back, right? But then what happens to your schools? What happens to your roads, right? What happens to the utility grid? I mean, there's a short-sightedness to giving up on government, and Republicans are banking on voters just not paying attention or not caring if all of their basic social services deteriorate. The homestead property tax, if you just took away property taxes on somebody's first home, that would cut a 25% hole in the Atlanta Public Schools budget, which how would they make that up? And the answer to in both cases is you pretty much have to raise sales taxes. You have to raise a consumption tax that is regressive, that affects people with less income and wealth the most. You have to do that to replace the lost revenues that you would lose from the income tax or the property tax. And we see that happening in every state that has done this quote unquote tax relief that gets rid of income taxes entirely or lowers them to a point where they're irrelevant. You see a bunch of cable fees pop up and all kinds of revenues in strange places. And it's the worst off in society. It's people who have the least who end up having to pay that. So government is really measured by its ability to raise revenues in a smart way from people who can afford to pay. You know, the Bible says, to whom much is given, much is expected. I think that's true of revenue policy. And then on the back end of it, are we using that money to fill needs in an efficient way? And I'll tell you what we shouldn't be doing is throwing billions of those dollars away just to get a few jobs imported by big corporations and call that economic development. Real economic development is making sure that kids are learning, public schools are funded. It's making sure that the grid can support new development projects, that we have up-to-date roads and water and sewer. It's making sure that basic social services are intact, that affordable housing exists, that we can subsidize enough units where people can stay in their historic communities and move here and work only one job and be able to afford to live near their workplace. That is real economic development.
Do you have some feeling about how rural areas have been affected by current policy and how that could change in order to make those areas of the state more prosperous?
Sure. Well, obviously there are cultural issues with brain drain where, people will grow up in a small town, doesn't have as many amenities as they might want. They might go to some four-year university and meet a bunch of friends from all over the place and say, I want to live a cosmopolitan life. I want to go to the big city. I want to go to Atlanta, or I want to go to some other major market around the country. And then, they're uprooting themselves from the communities they used to live in. Are there good paying jobs? Are there cultural opportunities? Can you go to a historic museum or theater? Or are there nice restaurants in town and bars to hang out in? These are questions that determine people's basic quality of life and when and where they want to locate. And so we need a rural development strategy that, again, is not just government is bad, government's in the way, let's get government out of the way. That's the talking point that GOP politicians from all kinds of rural areas in the state of Georgia will use constantly to keep getting reelected. They're failing to imagine what real rural development could look like. And again, the most specific stuff they may do is tax credits, is tax cuts. They might give a big timber producer a tax break on a timber crop, or a huge corporation, as I said, who wants to bring in a new factory. Okay, great. Maybe it's 300 jobs. Are those jobs being hired from local unions? Maybe not. Is the local government getting the help that it needs with the local grid to make sure that the water and sewer and electricity can support the new development, the office location and the people who will live there? Is there affordable housing? Maybe not. So real rural development is not just dropping these large scale corporate developments and hoping that the jobs just magically materialize and hoping that the local government can handle it. Real rural development means talking to local city council, talking to small businesses, asking, what do you need to revitalize your downtown? What do you need to make it easier to keep open that restaurant that everybody loves? What kind of tourism dollars would help you? What kind of transit options do you need? If we're car dependent, is there a possibility of getting a little bit of rail connecting major metros throughout the state? These are the questions that we want to be asking for more comprehensive rural development, because I think we live in a social media age where it's very easy for somebody like Brian Kemp to invite a new mega plant, claim it's a bunch of jobs, and then do a ribbon cutting. Use the big scissors and cut the ribbon and say, that's all the work we need to do. But ask any rural community that feels like it's being hollowed out if that's enough. And the answer is it's not enough.
Josh, do you have any specific ideas about how housing could be made more affordable in the state?
We do not do a fair valuation of commercial property. Commercial property assessments are off in this state. And if we were to fairly assess those properties, that would ease the burden on residential taxpayers, right? So you want to talk about real property tax relief. You could actually maybe find some wiggle room if the corporate payers were paying their fair share. Another big issue is zoning. You have a lot of zoning policy throughout the state that makes it impracticable or just not allowed for a developer to build a smaller lot size, smaller square footage. The first time home buyer average age is now up to 40 nationally. It was in the 20s a couple decades ago. It has moved through the 30s and now has reached the age of 40. That's a travesty. It means people coming out of college who are working their first job can't afford home ownership for many years. They're renting for a long time, and nothing wrong with renting. That makes sense for a lot of people, but you don't even have the option to try to buy your first home. So having something below $400,000, $500,000 that may be a couple $100,000, and it might be a little smaller, and the market may dictate that. But I think people are going to be okay with the idea of efficiency living if it's still comfortable in a safe neighborhood with access to amenities, and if they can build some equity. If those units could appreciate in value, it would be a good, what we call, starter home. So a little bit of zoning reform to make sure that municipalities and counties are creating some spaces that allow for that type of floor plan, I think would be a really good addition to the market. Just free up the developers to do that instead. Another thing is corporate ownership of housing. This is, I think, primarily a federal issue, but there are things the state can try to do to ensure that hedge funds and large corporations do not buy up all of the single family home stock that exists, or even just renter protections. I know when out of state corporate landlords own large amounts of multifamily stock, it can lead to neglect. At some point, we need to end corporate ownership of housing at this scale, limit starkly the amount of homes or rental properties they're even allowed to own at all. But we need to get corporations out of the single family home market for sure, because otherwise everything we're talking about young people, families being priced out of owning their own home, it just gets worse when corporate consolidation allows for snatching up all the supply so that there's not really much supply left on the market. But the state could be doing a lot more to ensure available stock and supply so that the market naturally creates affordable options for people.
How do you go about winning the voters of the state? What's your strategy for winning this election? And maybe it's a strategy that Democrats should be using.
Sure. I think people are tired of the Trump era, all the chaos, the Iran war, probably an illegal war, tariffs that jack up prices on everything, that make the planning landscape difficult for small businesses, you name it. Federal overreach, ICE and Customs and Border Patrol terrorizing American cities because Trump has political opponents he wants to punish. I mean, this stuff it feels like we're in some other country. It feels like we're not in the country that people came to know and love. And, even if we've got problems, at least in this country, we have institutions that are supposed to be able to solve them. We're supposed to have courts that are neutral and federal agencies that have internal ombudsmen and checks and balances, and something to stop this type of influence from spreading. But I think Americans are really waking up this year and realizing these influences within government that are destructive to government, that want to rip down all the guardrails that have held back presidential power before. I think people are realizing that we've got to speak up if we want to keep those guardrails in place. The tree of liberty must be watered. A republic, if you can keep it. This is not a situation where these problems will just take care of themselves. People have to show up and vote. People have to make their voices loud and clear and heard. Go to the No Kings rallies, be present, do all the things we need to do civic engagement wise to keep the pressure on the Trump administration and elect the right people to replace this regime at the federal level and the state level. So what I think it really comes down to is that voters are tired of the chaos, they're exhausted, and they want candidates who are going to have a steady hand, who are going to introduce some stability into everyday life and political life so that we don't have to check our phones every 5 minutes to see what kind of new chaos, some fresh hell has been created. So at the state level, I think being Democrats who can speak up to the abuses of the Trump administration and promise a more adult and mature style of leadership that really responds to people's needs, I think that's going to be very much in fashion in 2026. And we just have to communicate that to as many voters as we can.
Josh, we thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very